While staying at a luxury hotel, a millionaire was paralyzed upon seeing a cleaner identical to his lost love. She had been missing for 25 years. Ethan Carter stepped out of the sleek black car, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble entrance of the Sunrise Hotel. The towering structure gleamed under the setting sun, its glass facade reflecting streaks of amber and gold. The hotel was famous for its exclusivity, catering to the elite with promises of discretion and comfort. For Ethan, who rarely ventured outside the confines of his private estate, this was unfamiliar territory. His life, typically isolated by design, revolved around boardrooms, private jets, and the company of the few people he trusted. But tonight was different. An international business conference of critical importance had brought him here. His assistant had assured him that the Sunrise Hotel would provide the privacy he valued, far removed from prying eyes and unnecessary distractions. Ethan wasn't particularly fond of staying in hotels. The transient nature of it, the impermanence, had always felt unsettling. Still, he had agreed to this arrangement. He had, more out of necessity than preference. Inside the grand lobby, chandeliers hung like frozen cascades of crystal, their light reflecting off marble floors polished to a mirror-like sheen. A subtle scent of jasmine lingered in the air, and the soft hum of classical music played in the background. The concierge greeted him with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the Sunrise Hotel, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. "We trust your stay will be exceptional." Ethan gave a curt nod, not one for small talk. After confirming his suite, he made his way to the elevator, his mind already preoccupied with the high-stakes meetings scheduled for the following day. Dinner that evening was a formal affair in the hotel's exclusive restaurant. Ethan, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, sat among some of the world's most influential business figures. The room buzzed with conversation about market trends and global partnerships, but Ethan found it hard to focus. The sound of clinking glasses and murmured laughter around the table faded as his mind drifted. It had been 25 years since Isabel disappeared, and yet, her presence still lingered in his thoughts, like a shadow he couldn't escape. The last time he had seen her was during that fateful trip, her laughter echoing in his ears, the warmth of her hand in his. And then, in a single moment, she was gone. The memory of that day was as vivid as it was painful, a scar that never quite healed. When the dinner concluded, Ethan excused himself, eager to return to his suite and leave the heavy weight of memories behind. As he strode through the quiet, dimly lit corridors, the muffled hum of a vacuum cleaner caught his attention. Turning a corner, he froze, mid-step. There, just ahead, a young woman stood with her back to him, pushing a cleaning cart. Her uniform, crisp and neat, seemed almost too formal for the simplicity of her task for a moment. Ethan thought he was imagining it. The posture, the way her dark hair curled softly at the nape of her neck, it was hauntingly familiar. She adjusted something on the cart, turning slightly, and Ethan caught a glimpse of her profile. His breath hitched. It was her face, Isabel's face. The same delicate features, the same piercing eyes he had spent decades yearning to see again. He blinked, as though his mind were playing tricks on him, but when he looked again, the resemblance was undeniable. The young woman must have felt his gaze because she turned to face him fully. Her expression shifted from surprise to slight unease. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Ethan struggled to find his words. I'm sorry, you just reminded me of someone," he managed, his voice more shaken than he intended. The young woman gave him a polite but puzzled smile. "That happens sometimes," she said lightly before returning to her work. She pushed the cart into a nearby room, the door clicking softly shut behind her. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot, his chest tightening. The hallway, moments ago unremarkable, now felt charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Back in his suite, Ethan poured himself a generous glass of bourbon and sank into the armchair by the window. Outside, the city lights sparkled against the dark sky, but his focus was elsewhere. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The way she turned, the angle of her jaw, the glint in her eyes. It was too much of a coincidence. Ethan reached for his phone and dialed his assistant, Richard. "Richard," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to look into someone for me." "Of course, Mr. Carter. Who is it?" Richard replied, accustomed to his boss's unusual but precise demands. There's a young woman working here at the Sunrise Hotel. She's a cleaner. I need to know everything about her. Name, background, whatever you can find." Richard hesitated briefly. "Understood. I'll get on it right away." Ending the call, Ethan set the phone on the table and leaned back. His fingers tapped against the side of his glass as the weight of his thoughts bore down on him. He knew he was treading on irrational territory. He had spent years coming to terms with Isabel's disappearance, convincing himself to move forward. Yet, tonight had reopened a door he thought was permanently shut. He stared out the window, the city's glow reflecting faintly in his eyes. Somewhere, buried beneath layers of reason and doubt, a tiny ember of hope flickered to life. Could Isabel still be alive? The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's suite, casting golden patterns on the polished hardwood floor. Ethan stood near the window, his coffee untouched on the table behind him. His thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the events of the previous night. The young woman's face haunted him, a living echo of Isabel. He had spent hours dissecting every moment, trying to convince himself that it was just a bizarre coincidence. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had led him here. A knock on the door interrupted his reverie. Ethan crossed the room and opened it to find Richard, his assistant, standing there with a tablet in hand. Richard, as efficient as ever, had clearly spent the night gathering information. "I have the details you asked for, sir," Richard said, stepping inside. He swiped through a few screens on his tablet before handing it to Ethan. "Her name is Margaret Hall. She's 24 years old and has worked at the Sunrise Hotel for the past 2 years. Before that, she grew up in an orphanage in Savannah." "An orphanage?" Ethan repeated, his brows furrowing as he scanned the sparse information. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "It seems she doesn't know much about her origins. No records of parents or family, only that she was found abandoned as a baby near the outskirts of Savannah. She's lived a quiet, unremarkable life, at least on paper." Ethan's grip on the tablet tightened. An orphan with no known history. The coincidence was too glaring to ignore. His mind raced with possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Could Margaret somehow be connected to Isabel? Could she have been part of the life he never had the chance to share with the woman he loved? "Did you find anything else?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp with urgency. Richard hesitated. "Not yet, but I can dig deeper, but I can dig." "Do you want me to reach out to the orphanage?" Ethan shook his head, handing the tablet back. "Not yet. I'll handle this myself for now." Richard nodded, sensing the weight of whatever was stirring in Ethan's mind. "If you need anything, just let me know." Once Richard left, Ethan sat down on the edge of his bed. His head in his hands, he was venturing into dangerous territory, reopening old wounds that had never fully healed. But the pull was irresistible. Margaret wasn't just a random stranger who happened to look like Isabel. There was something about her, something he couldn't explain. Determined, Ethan decided to speak to Margaret directly. He needed answers, and she was the only one who could provide them. Later that afternoon, Ethan wandered through the hotel's hallways, his usual composed demeanor replaced with a restless energy. It didn't take long to find Margaret. She was in the same corridor as the night before, meticulously cleaning a row of brass fixtures near a suite door. Her uniform was neat, her dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She moved with quiet efficiency, completely unaware of the storm of questions brewing in Ethan's mind. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm. She turned, startled, her eyes meeting his. "Yes, sir." For a moment, Ethan was at a loss for words. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Her features mirrored Isabel's so perfectly that it made his chest tighten. "I wanted to apologize for last night," he said finally. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "It's okay. I just wasn't expecting, well, that kind of reaction." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." Margaret offered a polite smile, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Really? That's unusual, I guess." "Unusual doesn't even begin to cover it," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He studied her for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" Her brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. "I guess so." "Do you know much about your family, your past?" he asked, keeping his tone as gentle as possible. Margaret's expression softened into something closer to sadness. "Not really. I grew up in an orphanage. They told me I was found as a baby, but no one ever came looking for me." She paused, glancing down at her hands. "I guess it's just something I've learned to live with." Ethan's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to align, but the picture they formed was almost too overwhelming to process. "I see," he said quietly. He wanted to press further, to ask about every detail of her life, but he could sense she wasn't ready for that. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever want to talk more about it, I'd like to help." Margaret hesitated before taking the card. "That's kind of you, thank you." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing ahead. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that Margaret's story was intertwined with his own, but there was still so much he didn't know, so much he needed to uncover. As Margaret returned to her work, Ethan walked away, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just chasing a resemblance anymore. He was chasing the truth. Ethan spent the rest of the day pacing his suite, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of what he'd learned. Margaret's story was too eerily aligned with Isabel's disappearance to be a coincidence. He needed something concrete, something that could tie her to the past he had been forced to leave behind. By early evening, Ethan decided to take another step. He called Richard again. "Richard," he said as soon as the line connected, "I need you to find out everything you can about the orphanage where Margaret grew up. I want names, records, anything they have on her." "Understood, Mr. Carter. I'll start digging immediately," Richard replied, his voice steady. Ethan ended the call and poured himself another drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass as he stared out the window. The city below was alive with movement, but Ethan felt as though he were trapped in a bubble, isolated from the world. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Isabel wasn't as lost to him as he had believed. The next morning, Ethan decided to find Margaret again. He needed to keep the momentum going, to learn more about her directly. After a brief inquiry with the hotel staff, he discovered she was assigned to clean the East Wing that day. He made his way there, his steps purposeful, but his mind a chaotic storm of questions. Margaret was in the hallway, as expected, dusting the ornate light fixtures that lined the walls. She glanced up as he approached, her expression a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "Mr. Carter?" she greeted politely, setting down her duster. "Did you need something?" "I'm sorry to bother you again," Ethan began, his voice calm but insistent. "I know this might seem odd, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to tell me more about your past. You mentioned the orphanage, but is there anything else you know? Anything you've kept from that time?" Margaret hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. "There's not much to tell," she said cautiously. "I've never really known where I came from or who my family is. The people at the orphanage didn't have any answers either." Ethan studied her, sensing she was holding something back. "Margaret," he said gently, "I don't mean to pry, but if there's anything at all, it could be important." Margaret seemed to weigh his words carefully before nodding. "There is one thing," she admitted. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small, tarnished pendant attached to a delicate chain. "I've had this for as long as I can remember. The nuns at the orphanage said it was with me when they found me." Ethan's breath caught as he stared at the pendant. It was simple, yet elegant, engraved with the initials E and I. His mind reeled. Those initials, they were his and Isabel's. He had given her a necklace just like this one years ago, during their first trip together. "May I see it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, then handed it over. Ethan held the pendant in his palm, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the engraved letters. The memories flooded back unbidden. The day he had bought it, Isabel's laughter when she first saw it, the way she had worn it every day after. "Do you know what the letters mean?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Margaret shook her head. "No, I always thought they might be a clue, but I've never been able to figure it out." Ethan returned the pendant to her, his mind racing. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "You should hold on to it." Margaret tucked the pendant back into her pocket, her expression thoughtful. "You seem really interested in all of this," she said after a moment. "Why?" Ethan met her gaze, his jaw tightening. He couldn't tell her the full truth. Not yet. "Let's just say I have a feeling your past might be more significant than you realize." Margaret tilted her head, clearly puzzled, but she didn't press him further. "If you say so, Mr. Carter." Ethan returned to his suite, his emotions in turmoil. The pendant was undeniable proof that Margaret was connected to Isabel somehow. The question was how. Could Margaret be Isabel's daughter? And if so, what did that mean about Isabel herself? Had she survived the accident after all? He called Richard again, this time his voice sharper, more urgent. "Richard, I need those orphanage records as soon as possible, and start digging into missing persons cases from Savannah 25 years ago. Cross-reference anything with the initials E and I." "Understood, sir. I'll have updates for you by the end of the day," Richard replied. Ethan hung up and sank into his armchair, the weight of the pendant's discovery pressing heavily on him. He had spent years trying to let go of the pain, trying to move forward. But now, the possibility of finding answers, and perhaps even Isabel herself, was all-consuming. For the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of hope, and this time, he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Ethan sat in the quiet of his suite, the pendant's image seared into his mind. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window as the city lights twinkled below. But he saw none of it. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the day he lost Isabel, a memory he had buried deep but never forgotten. It had been a bright summer morning, the kind of day where everything seemed touched by golden light. Isabel had insisted they take a spontaneous trip down the coast, something Ethan had hesitated about at first. His work schedule was packed, and taking a few days off felt irresponsible. But Isabel's laughter, the way she tugged on his hand with that irresistible smile, it had melted his resolve. "Come on," she had teased, her green eyes sparkling. "The world won't stop turning if you leave for a few days." "I promise." Ethan had relented. And for those brief days, he had felt alive in a way his relentless pursuit of success never provided. They drove for hours along winding coastal roads, the windows down and the ocean breeze whipping through Isabel's hair. She had been radiant, leaning out the window to feel the wind, her scarf fluttering behind her like a banner. Then, everything changed in an instant. The crash came out of nowhere. Ethan had swerved to avoid a deer darting across the road, the car skidding on loose gravel before slamming into a tree. When he came to, Isabel was gone. The passenger door hung open, her scarf tangled in the brush nearby. Ethan stumbled from the wreck, calling her name into the dense woods. He searched for hours, his voice growing hoarse, but there was no sign of her. The authorities arrived and the search intensified. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs combed the area. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing. No body, no clues. Just Isabel's scarf and the pendant he had given her. It had been 25 years, and the questions still haunted him. Why hadn't they found her? How could she have vanished without a trace? Ethan shook himself from the memory, his chest tight. The pendant Margaret carried. It was no coincidence. He was sure of it now. Somehow, it had ended up with her, and that meant there was more to the story than he had ever imagined. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Richard. "I found something," Richard said without preamble. The orphanage records list Margaret as arriving there around 25 years ago, found near the outskirts of Savannah. There's no birth certificate or identifying information, just a note that she was found wrapped in a blanket with that pendant. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. And the missing persons cases. "There's a match." "Sir," Richard continued, "Isabel's disappearance was logged in the national database at the time, and the timeline aligns. The location where Margaret was found is less than 30 miles from the crash site." Ethan exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was almost too much to comprehend. "What about Isabel?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. "Was there anything else?" "Not yet," Richard admitted, "but I'm expanding the search. If Isabel survived, there might be medical records or other evidence. I'll keep you updated." "Good. Keep digging," Ethan said before hanging up. He leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. If Margaret was connected to Isabel, then finding her might be the key to solving the mystery that had haunted him for decades. The next morning, Ethan found Margaret in the staff lounge, taking a short break between her duties. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, setting her coffee cup down. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I was hoping to talk to you," Ethan said, his tone gentler now. He sat across from her, his gaze steady. "I know I've been asking a lot of questions, but I think there's something important about your past. Something you deserve to know." Margaret's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "That pendant you carry? It belonged to someone I cared about deeply. She disappeared a long time ago, and I think there might be a connection between her and you." Margaret stared at him, confusion and disbelief mingling in her expression. "You think I'm connected to this person, how?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted. "But the timing, the location, even the pendant, it all lines up. I need to find out the truth, and I think you might be the key." Margaret leaned back, her arms crossed as she processed his words. "I don't know, Mr. Carter. I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from, and honestly, I stopped hoping for answers a long time ago." "I understand," Ethan said softly. "But don't you want to know if there's even a chance that this could lead to something meaningful? Wouldn't it be worth exploring?" Margaret looked away, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the pocket where she kept the pendant. After a long moment, she sighed. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but I don't even know where to start." Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Let me help. I have resources, connections, things that could make a difference. All I ask is that you trust me." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her guarded expression softening slightly. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll give it a chance." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. It wasn't just about finding Isabel anymore. It was about giving Margaret the answers she deserved. And maybe, just maybe, finding the closure he had been searching for all these years. Ethan's private car sped along the highway, leaving the bustling city behind as he and Margaret headed toward Savannah. The morning was crisp, the sun casting a golden hue over the fields and scattered trees that lined the road. Ethan sat in silence, his thoughts churning as Margaret stared out the window, her fingers absently clutching the pendant that had sparked the journey. Margaret was skeptical, unsure if this trip would provide any answers, but a part of her, buried beneath years of unanswered questions, clung to the possibility that Ethan might be right. If there was even a sliver of a chance to uncover her origins, she had to take it. Their first stop was the orphanage where Margaret had spent her childhood. The building was a modest brick structure, its paint peeling and its sign faded. Ethan felt a pang of unease as they approached, his usual composure giving way to a mix of anticipation and dread. The door creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She introduced herself as Sister Eleanor, one of the nuns who had cared for Margaret years ago. "Margaret," the nun said warmly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "It's been so long. Look at you, so grown up." Margaret smiled nervously. "It's good to see you again, sister. This is Mr. Carter. He's helping me look into my past." Sister Eleanor's gaze shifted to Ethan, her expression curious but welcoming. "Come in, both of you. Let's see what we can find." They followed her into a small office lined with old file cabinets and faded photographs of children who had passed through the orphanage over the decades. Sister Eleanor rummaged through one of the cabinets, pulling out a thin folder labeled with Margaret's name. "This is all we have," she said, handing the folder to Margaret. "I wish it were more." Margaret opened the folder, her eyes scanning the sparse contents. There was a short report describing how she had been found wrapped in a blanket near a country road. With no identifying documents or witnesses, the only item left with her was the pendant. Ethan leaned over to look, his heart racing as he read the details. The location where Margaret had been found wasn't far from the site of Isabel's disappearance. It was all too coincidental. "Do you remember anything else?" "Sister," Ethan asked, his tone steady but urgent. "Anything about the night she was brought here?" Sister Eleanor frowned in concentration. "I wasn't here when she was found, but I remember hearing that it was a stormy night. The man who brought her in, he didn't give his name, just said he found her by the road and wanted to make sure she was safe. It always seemed strange to me, though, the way he left so quickly, almost like he didn't want to be seen." Ethan exchanged a glance with Margaret, both of them feeling the weight of the revelation. The man's identity remained a mystery, but his actions hinted at something more deliberate. "Do you still have the blanket?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. Sister Eleanor nodded. "We keep everything. Let me get it for you." She disappeared into the back room and returned moments later with a small, worn blanket. Margaret took it gingerly, her fingers brushing over the faded fabric. Ethan noticed her eyes glistening, though she said nothing. As they left the orphanage, Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "This is a start," he said gently. "We're closer than we were before." Margaret nodded, clutching the blanket tightly. I don't know what to feel. It's overwhelming." Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. "Take your time. We'll figure this out together." Their next stop was the location where Margaret had been found, a stretch of road flanked by dense woods. Ethan parked the car on the shoulder, and they both stepped out, the air still and heavy with unspoken questions. "This is where it happened," Margaret murmured, her eyes scanning the area. "It's hard to imagine someone just leaving a baby here." Ethan studied the surroundings, his gaze narrowing as he tried to imagine the scene. The proximity to where Isabel's car had crashed wasn't lost on him. He could almost feel the echoes of the past in the quiet stillness of the forest. They wandered a short distance into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the only sound. Margaret suddenly stopped, her eyes widening as she pointed to a tree. "There," she said, her voice trembling. "That carving, it looks familiar." Ethan followed her gaze and saw it, a crude heart carved into the bark, with the initials E&I inside. His breath caught. "I did that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Margaret turned to him, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. "What do you mean?" Ethan stepped closer to the tree, running his fingers over the weathered carving. "Isabel and I used to come here. It was our spot. I carved this for her the day I gave her the pendant." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. You think this is where she—" "I don't know," Ethan interrupted gently, "but this means we're on the right track." The discovery hung heavy between them as they returned to the car. The questions were piling up, but one thing was clear. The connection between Margaret and Isabel was undeniable, and whatever answers they were searching for were closer than ever. The drive back to the Sunrise Hotel was heavy with silence. Margaret stared out the window, the blanket and pendant cradled in her lap like fragile relics. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. The carving, the location, the timing. It all pointed toward a truth that was almost too extraordinary to believe. Isabel wasn't just connected to Margaret's past. She might still be alive. As they stepped into the hotel lobby, the atmosphere seemed to hum with the same tension they carried. The gleaming marble floors and quiet murmur of activity felt almost surreal after the revelations they'd uncovered. Ethan walked Margaret to the staff area, where she could drop off her things. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "If you need a moment to process everything, take it. This is a lot." Margaret gave him a faint smile, her fingers still gripping the pendant. "I'm okay. Thank you for helping me, Mr. Carter. I don't think I could have done this alone." He nodded, his throat tightening. There was a weight in her gratitude, a sense of shared purpose that only deepened his resolve. He watched her disappear into the staff area before turning toward the hotel restaurant. He hadn't eaten all day, and though his appetite was faint, he needed a moment to think. The restaurant was quiet, its tables illuminated by soft candlelight. Ethan ordered a simple meal, more for the pretense of normalcy than out of hunger. As he sipped his water, his eyes scanned the room absently, until they stopped at the far end of the kitchen. Partially visible through the swinging doors was a woman. She moved gracefully, her hands deftly plating dishes. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, streaked lightly with gray, but her posture, her movements, they struck a familiar chord. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He leaned forward slightly, his breath catching in his chest as she turned. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and he felt the world tilt on its axis. It was Isabel. The shock sent a wave of heat through his body, followed by a chill. She looked different, aged by time, but there was no mistaking her. The woman who had haunted his dreams for 25 years was standing just feet away, alive and seemingly unaware of the life she had left behind. Ethan's first instinct was to rush toward her, to call her name and demand an explanation, but something held him back. What if she didn't recognize him? What if she didn't remember anything? He couldn't risk startling her, not when they were so close to answers. Margaret returned to the dining area moments later, spotting Ethan's pale face and wide eyes. "Mr. Carter, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ethan turned to her, his voice tight. "Margaret, I think I just saw her." Margaret blinked, confused. "Who?" He gestured subtly toward the kitchen. "Isabel, she's here, in this hotel. She's working as a cook." Margaret's jaw dropped, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. "That can't be. Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm certain. She might look different, but it's her." Margaret's gaze flicked between Ethan and the kitchen, her emotions swirling. "What do we do? Do we talk to her?" Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He wanted nothing more than to rush in and confront Isabel, but something told him to wait. If Isabel truly didn't remember her past, he had to approach her carefully. "No," he said finally. "Not yet. If she doesn't remember, we can't overwhelm her. Let's take this step by step." Margaret nodded reluctantly, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her impatience. "What's the plan then?" Ethan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "First, we need to confirm that it's really her. We'll find a way to speak to her without raising suspicion. If it is Isabel, we'll figure out the rest from there." Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the pendant again. "I can't believe this. She's been here this whole time." Ethan's expression softened. "If she has, then maybe she's been waiting for us too. We just have to handle this the right way." Over the next few days, Ethan and Margaret carefully observed Isabel from a distance, gathering small details about her routine. She worked long hours in the kitchen, her movements efficient and methodical. The staff referred to her as Anna, a name that felt foreign to Ethan's ears. Margaret grew more anxious with each passing day, her longing for answers gnawing at her. "Mr. Carter, I don't know how much longer I can wait. What if she leaves? What if we miss our chance?" Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't. I promise. But this has to be done right." Finally, the opportunity came, late one evening, when the restaurant was nearly empty. Isabel stepped out of the kitchen to collect supplies from the storeroom. Ethan and Margaret exchanged a glance before quietly following her. Isabel, or Anna, as she was called now, was kneeling to organize a shelf when she turned and spotted them. Her brow furrowed slightly, her gaze settling on Ethan with an air of recognition. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious. Ethan's throat tightened. Hearing her voice again was like a jolt to his system. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, but do you recognize us? Even a little?" Isabel tilted her head, her expression puzzled. "I'm not sure. Have we met before?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You may not remember me, but I think you're someone I lost a long time ago." Isabel's confusion deepened, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that hinted at a memory buried deep. The storeroom felt suffocatingly small as Ethan stood before Isabel, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret hovered behind him, clutching the pendant in her trembling hand, while Isabel, or Anna, as the hotel staff knew her, watched them both with a mix of confusion and guarded curiosity. "I'm sorry," Isabel said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, yet firm, as though she were trying to steady herself. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." Ethan's breath hitched. He had expected this, prepared himself for it even, but hearing those words stung more than he could have imagined. The woman standing before him, the love of his life, had no idea who he was. "Please," Ethan said, his voice low and measured, though emotion threatened to spill over. "Just hear me out. You look exactly like someone I knew, someone I lost a long time ago." Isabel frowned, her eyes darting between him and Margaret. "I don't understand. Who are you?" Ethan took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "My name is Ethan Carter. 25 years ago, I was with someone. Someone I loved more than anything in this world. Her name was Isabel, and you looked just like her." The mention of the name made Isabel blink. A flicker of something. Confusion, recognition, or maybe even fear, crossing her face. She looked away, shaking her head as though trying to clear her thoughts. I don't know who you think I am," she said hesitantly. "My name is Anna. I've been here for years. I don't remember anything about an Isabel." Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling but insistent. "I think you might be her, and if you are, you might be connected to me too." Isabel's brow furrowed deeply as she turned her attention to Margaret. "What are you talking about?" Margaret hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the pendant. She held it out for Isabel to see. "This was found with me when I was a baby. I grew up in an orphanage, and I've never known who my parents were. But Mr. Carter says this belonged to someone named Isabel. If that's true, then you might be my mother." Isabel stared at the pendant, her face unreadable. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing over the tarnished surface. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were on the verge of saying something, but no words came. Ethan watched her intently, his chest tightening with every passing second. "Does it mean anything to you?" he asked gently. "Do you recognize it?" Isabel turned the pendant over in her hands, her expression distant. "I don't know," she murmured. "It feels familiar, but I don't know why." Margaret's voice broke through the tension. "Do you remember anything about your past, before you came here?" Isabel's hands tightened around the pendant as she closed her eyes. "Not really," she admitted. "I've tried to remember, but it's all a blur. The earliest thing I can recall is waking up in a small house outside Savannah. A family took me in. They said I'd been found after some kind of accident. I couldn't even remember my name." Ethan's throat tightened. The timeline matched perfectly. The location, the pendant. Everything was falling into place. Yet Isabel's fragmented memories were like shards of a puzzle that refused to come together. "What happened to the family who took you in?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. "They passed away a few years ago," Isabel replied, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I stayed with them as long as I could, but after they were gone, I needed to find work. That's how I ended up here." Margaret stepped closer, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "Do you think it's possible that you're Isabel? That you're my mother?" Isabel stared at Margaret, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't remember, but something about all of this feels right, like it could be true." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The woman he had searched for, grieved for, was standing before him, and yet she was still out of reach. But there was hope, a fragile thread connecting them all. He had to believe it was enough. "Let us help you," Ethan said, his voice firm but kind. "There are ways to find out for sure. A DNA test could give us answers." Isabel hesitated, her fingers still clutching the pendant. She looked between Ethan and Margaret, her guarded expression softening. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. What if I'm not who you think I am?" Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll know the truth. But if you are, this could be the chance to find the family you didn't know you had." Margaret nodded, her voice trembling. "Please, Anna, or Isabel, or whoever you are, just give this a chance. If there's even a small chance that we're connected, don't you want to know?" For a long moment, Isabel said nothing. The room was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "We can do the test." Relief washed over Ethan and Margaret like a tidal wave. They exchanged a glance, their shared hope palpable. "We'll figure this out together," Ethan said, his voice steady. No matter what, as they left the storeroom, the weight of the decision settled over them all. The test would bring answers that could either unite them or leave them grappling with more questions. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt a spark of hope, and he held on to it tightly. The days that followed were filled with nervous anticipation. Ethan, Margaret, and Isabel, now caught in a web of tentative connections, waited for the results of the DNA test. For Ethan, each passing moment felt like an eternity. His mind oscillated between hope and fear. Margaret, while outwardly calm, struggled with her own emotions. the possibility of finally finding her mother a bittersweet mix of excitement and dread. Isabel, however, was the most unsettled. Though she had agreed to the test, doubts gnawed at her. She couldn't reconcile the life she knew, a life filled with gaps and fleeting memories, with the possibility that she was the woman Ethan and Margaret believed her to be. She spent her free moments pacing her small apartment, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand as if it could somehow unlock the answers she needed. The test results arrived 3 days later. Ethan had arranged for them to be delivered to the hotel directly. He, Margaret, and Isabel gathered in his suite, the envelope resting on the coffee table like an uninvited guest. Margaret fidgeted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together. "Should we open it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced at Isabel, his gaze steady but questioning. "Are you ready?" Isabel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Let's get it over with." Ethan picked up the envelope, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. He carefully tore it open, unfolded the papers, and scanned the results. His breath caught, and his hands trembled ever so slightly as he lowered the document. "It's true," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Isabel, you're Margaret's mother." Margaret's gasp broke the silence. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to Isabel, her expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. "You're really my mom." Isabel stared at Ethan, then at Margaret, her lips parted in silent shock. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice trembling. Margaret couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned forward, taking Isabel's hands in her own. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her tears spilling freely. "I've been waiting my whole life to find you. Just knowing you're here. It's enough." Isabel's composure cracked, and tears slid down her cheeks as she pulled Margaret into a tight embrace. The two women clung to each other, their shared grief and joy flowing freely. Ethan watched, his own eyes misting as a sense of completeness settled over him for the first time in decades, as the initial wave of emotion subsided. Questions began to surface. Isabel wiped her tears and looked at Ethan, her brow furrowed. "But how? How did this happen? How did I lose you both?" Ethan took a deep breath, his voice measured as he began to recount the events of that fateful day. "We were on a trip, just the two of us. There was an accident. I lost control of the car, and when I woke up, you were gone. We searched for weeks, but there was no trace of you. I thought you were dead." Isabel listened intently, her expression shifting between sadness and confusion. "I don't remember any of that," she admitted. "The earliest memory I have is waking up in a strange house. A couple took me in. They said they found me wandering near the road, hurt and disoriented. I didn't know who I was or where I came from." Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle. "And you never remembered anything, not even small details?" "Nothing clear," Isabel said, shaking her head. "Just flashes, images that didn't make sense. And then I started over. I didn't have a choice." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They didn't try to find out who you were. They didn't report you to the authorities." "They told me they did," Isabel replied, her voice uncertain. "But now, I don't know. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they thought it was easier to keep me than to involve anyone else." The room fell into a heavy silence as they absorbed her words. Ethan's mind churned, piecing together the fragmented story. The couple who found her had good intentions, perhaps, but their actions had stolen decades of what could have been. Later that evening, Ethan and Margaret sat together on the balcony of his suite, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky. Isabel had retreated to her apartment, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. "Do you think she'll ever remember everything?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But even if she doesn't, we know the truth now. That's what matters." Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "It's strange. I've spent so many years wondering who I was, where I came from, and now that I know, I feel like I'm meeting a stranger." "She's not a stranger," Ethan said gently. "She's your mother, and you're giving her something she's been missing too. You're giving her a connection to the life she lost." Margaret smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the pendant that now rested around her neck. "I hope she feels that way." "She does," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "You can see it in her eyes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of the day slowly giving way to a sense of cautious hope. There were still many questions to be answered, many wounds to heal, but for the first time in years, they had a foundation to build on. In her apartment, Isabel sat alone, turning the pendant over in her hands. Her memories were still a fog, but one thing was clear. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a daughter, a family, a second chance. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered into the quiet room. Margaret. The name felt foreign yet familiar, like something she had always known but couldn't place. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she might not have to face the world alone anymore. The following days were a delicate balancing act for everyone involved, while the DNA results had confirmed the truth. The emotional complexities of reconnecting weighed heavily on Ethan, Margaret, and Isabel. It wasn't as simple as embracing the newfound bond and moving forward. There were decades of separation, unanswered questions, and fractured memories to confront. Ethan spent most of his time strategizing how to help Isabel recover the missing pieces of her past. He contacted specialists, hoping therapy or memory recall techniques could unlock what Isabel had lost. Yet, he was careful not to push her. Isabel's fragile state required patience, a quality Ethan had rarely exercised in his high-stakes business life. Margaret, on the other hand, struggled with her own emotions. She had dreamed of finding her mother for as long as she could remember, but now that it had happened, she wasn't sure how to navigate the reality of it. Isabel's tentative demeanor made Margaret wonder if her mother truly wanted to embrace their connection, or if guilt and obligation were driving her actions. In the hotel's cafe, Margaret sipped her tea while Ethan sat across from her, reviewing some notes he had jotted down. The air between them was quiet, but charged with unspoken tension. "Do you think she regrets finding out the truth?" Margaret asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan set his notes down, meeting her gaze. "Why would you think that?" Margaret shrugged, tracing the edge of her cup with her finger. "She seems so distant. I know she's overwhelmed, but I don't know. Sometimes it feels like she's pulling away instead of leaning in." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but empathetic. "It's not easy for her, Margaret. Imagine waking up one day and realizing the life you've been living wasn't yours to begin with. That kind of shock takes time to process." "I get that," Margaret said softly. I've wanted this for so long. I don't want to lose her now that I've finally found her." "You're not going to lose her," Ethan assured her. "She's here, and she's trying. That's what matters." Margaret nodded, though her heart still felt heavy with uncertainty. Meanwhile, Isabel found herself retreating more often than she intended. She spent hours walking the quiet paths around the hotel, her thoughts swirling as she tried to reconcile the pieces of her fractured identity. The pendant now hung around her neck again, its weight both comforting and daunting. One afternoon, she wandered into the small park behind the hotel, finding a secluded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. Sitting there, she closed her eyes and let the warm breeze wash over her face. She tried to summon memories, any memory, but the harder she tried, the further they seemed to slip away. "Isabel," a voice said gently, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened her eyes to find Ethan standing a few feet away, his expression soft. He hadn't called her by her old name since their initial confrontation in the storeroom, respecting her hesitance to fully accept it. The sound of it now startled her, though not unpleasantly. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded, and he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of children playing and birds chirping filled the silence between them. "I know this is hard for you," Ethan began, his voice measured, "and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for, but I also don't want you to feel like you have to go through this alone." Isabel glanced at him, her eyes tinged with doubt. "I appreciate that, but I don't even know who I am. How can I move forward with Margaret? With you, if I don't know where I fit into all of this?" Ethan exhaled, his gaze steady. "You're not defined by the gaps in your memory. You're Isabel, or Anna, or whoever you choose to be. What matters is that you have people who care about you now. Margaret is here. I'm here. That's a start." Isabel's lips quirked in a faint smile. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," Ethan admitted, "but it's worth it." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before Isabel finally spoke again, her voice soft. "Do you think Margaret is disappointed in me?" Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed. Disappointed, why would you think that? She's been waiting her whole life for this, Isabel said, her hands twisting the pendant nervously. And here I am, a mess who can't even remember the first moment I held her. How do I live up to that? Ethan placed a hand over hers, stilling her anxious movements. You don't have to live up to anything. Margaret doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to try. Isabel nodded, though the doubt lingered in her eyes. I'll try, she said quietly. For her. Later that evening, the three of them gathered for dinner in the hotel's private dining room. It was Ethan's idea, a chance to create a sense of normalcy amid the chaos of their situation. He ordered their meals ahead of time, selecting dishes he remembered Isabel loving all those years ago. The conversation was cautious at first, but as the night went on, the tension eased. Margaret shared stories from her childhood at the orphanage, filling the silence with anecdotes that brought occasional laughter and smiles. Isabel listened intently, her eyes softening as she absorbed the pieces of her daughter's life she had missed. By the end of the meal, a tentative connection had begun to form, a fragile thread of hope binding them together as they parted ways for the night. Margaret hugged Isabel tightly. "Good night, Mom," she whispered, the words hesitant but filled with warmth. Isabel froze for a moment, then returned the embrace, her voice trembling as she replied, "Good night, Margaret." Ethan watched them, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The days following their shared dinner felt lighter, as if an invisible weight had begun to lift from all their shoulders. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Ethan, Margaret, and Isabel found themselves cautiously navigating their newfound bond. The quiet tension that once lingered between them was replaced with the beginnings of understanding. One sunny morning, Ethan invited Margaret and Isabel to join him for a day outside the hotel. He had arranged a trip to a nearby botanical garden, hoping the peaceful environment would foster a sense of connection. At first, Isabel hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready for another step forward. But when Margaret looked at her with hopeful eyes, she agreed. The gardens were sprawling and vibrant, a maze of colorful blooms and winding paths shaded by towering oaks. Isabel walked beside Margaret, their conversation light but steady. Ethan trailed behind, content to observe the bond forming between them. For the first time in decades, he felt something close to peace. Margaret paused near a bed of lavender, crouching to take in the fragrant scent. "This reminds me of the fields behind the orphanage," she said, glancing at Isabel. "There was this one spot where wild lavender grew. I used to sit there for hours when I needed to think." Isabel smiled faintly, kneeling beside her. "It's beautiful," she murmured, brushing her fingers over the delicate stems. "I'm glad you had places like that." Margaret hesitated, then turned to face her mother fully. "I always wished you were there. Every time I sat in that field, I'd imagine you finding me, taking me home. It's what kept me going." Isabel's breath hitched, her eyes glistening as she reached out to take Margaret's hand. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "If I had known, if I could have remembered, I would have come for you." Margaret squeezed her hand, her voice trembling. "I know, and now we have this chance, that's what matters." Ethan watched from a distance, his chest tightening at the sight. He had always known Margaret was strong, but seeing her offer forgiveness so freely was humbling. Isabel, too, was finding her way, piece by piece. It was more than he could have hoped for. Later that afternoon, the three of them sat together on a shaded bench overlooking a sparkling pond. Isabel, for the first time, shared snippets of her life as Anna, the family who had taken her in, the quiet years spent learning to cook, and the solace she found in the simplicity of her new world. "It wasn't much," she admitted, her gaze distant. "But it was safe. I didn't know what I'd lost, so I didn't know to miss it." Margaret leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Do you miss it now, that life?" Isabel hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it was all I knew then. But now I feel like I've been given something better. Something real." Ethan smiled at her words, his voice warm as he spoke. "You have, and we're here for you, Isabel, for whatever comes next." Isabel's lips curved into a tentative smile, her heart swelling at the sincerity in his voice. For the first time, She allowed herself to believe that she could belong to something more than the shadows of her fragmented past. That evening, back at the hotel, Ethan decided it was time to share a piece of their old life with Isabel. He invited her and Margaret to his suite, where he had prepared something special. On the coffee table sat a small box, its worn edges a testament to its age. "I've kept this with me all these years," Ethan said as he opened the box, revealing a collection of photographs and trinkets. "It's everything I had left of you, Isabel." Isabel stared at the contents, her fingers trembling as she reached for a photograph. It was a candid shot of her and Ethan, her laughter frozen in time as he leaned toward her with a playful grin. The memory was faint, like a whisper, but it was there. "I remember this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We were at the lake." Ethan nodded, his heart aching at the flicker of recognition in her eyes. "You always loved that spot." Margaret leaned closer, her gaze shifting between the photo and her mother. "You look so happy." "We were," Ethan said softly. "It wasn't perfect, but it was ours." Isabel's eyes filled with tears as she picked up a small shell from the box. "I found this on the beach that day. You teased me because I insisted on keeping it." "I never stopped hoping you'd come back for it," Ethan admitted. Isabel clutched the shell tightly, her tears falling freely now. "I wish I could remember more. I want to remember it all." Margaret placed a comforting hand on her mother's shoulder. "You will," she said with quiet certainty. "We'll help you." As the night wore on, the three of them sat together, sharing stories and piecing together fragments of the life they had lost. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a foundation for something new. For the first time, Isabel felt a glimmer of hope that the past didn't have to define her. She had a family now, one that was willing to fight for her, and that was enough. Before they parted for the night, Isabel turned to Ethan, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "Thank you," she said, "for never giving up on me." Ethan smiled, his eyes warm. "How could I? You're worth every second of the wait." Margaret wrapped her arms around Isabel, holding her tightly. "We're a family now," she said. "Nothing's going to change that." As Isabel returned the embrace, she allowed herself to believe it. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, the future felt like something to look forward to. The morning air was crisp and full of promise, as sunlight poured through the large windows of the Sunrise Hotel's private dining room. Ethan had arranged one final breakfast for himself, Margaret, and Isabel before their time together at the hotel came to a close. Today wasn't just another gathering. It was a celebration of the family they had rediscovered, and a look toward the life they were ready to build together. Isabel, seated between Ethan and Margaret, felt a strange but comforting sense of belonging. For years, she had lived in quiet solitude, her life a series of routines with no clear purpose. Now, she was surrounded by two people who, despite the weight of time and unanswered questions, had accepted her without hesitation. "I can't believe it's been a week," Margaret said, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "It feels like everything has changed, and yet, like it's exactly how it's supposed to be." Ethan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's because it is. We found what we thought we lost." Isabel looked down at her hands, her fingers brushing the pendant now resting against her chest. "I still don't know how to make up for all the time we've lost," she admitted. "I don't know how to be the mother Margaret deserves." Margaret reached over, her hand resting gently on Isabel's. "You don't have to make up for anything," she said softly. "You're here now, and that's all I've ever wanted." Isabel's eyes glistened with tears, and she squeezed Margaret's hand in gratitude. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the pieces of her past didn't need to be perfect for her to move forward. After breakfast, the trio decided to take one last walk through the hotel gardens. The lush pathways were alive with color, the flowers in full bloom as if reflecting the new life they had found in each other. Isabel walked slowly, her steps deliberate as she took in the vibrant scenery. Margaret stayed close by, while Ethan trailed a few steps behind, content to watch the two women he cared for more than anything in the world. They stopped near a quiet pond, the surface glinting like glass in the morning sun. Isabel turned to face them both, her expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," she began. "For so long, I thought I didn't have a future, but now, I want to try. I want to be part of this family. Our family. Margaret's face lit up with a smile. You already are. Ethan stepped closer, his voice warm and steady. We'll figure it out together, Isabel. Whatever it takes. Isabel looked between them, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, for not giving up on me. As they returned to the hotel, Ethan led them to his suite one last time. He had a surprise planned, something he had been working on since the moment the DNA results confirmed Isabel and Margaret's connection. I know we're taking things one step at a time, Ethan said as he opened the door, but I wanted to give you both something to start this new chapter. Inside, a small table was set up with 3 wrapped boxes, each one tied with a ribbon. Margaret and Isabel exchanged curious glances as they stepped inside. Ethan gestured for them to take the boxes. Go ahead, open them. Margaret tore into hers first, revealing a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, each one blank and ready to be filled. I thought you might want a place to write about this journey, Ethan said, to keep track of the memories we're making. Margaret beamed. It's perfect, thank you. Isabel opened her box next, her breath catching as she pulled out a delicate silver frame. Inside was a copy of the photograph Ethan had shown her days earlier, the one of them laughing by the lake. I thought you might like to have a piece of our past to hold on to, Ethan said. And maybe, as we make new memories, we can add more to the collection. Isabel's fingers brushed over the frame, her expression softening. It's beautiful. I'll treasure it. Finally, Ethan opened his own box, revealing a matching set of pendants. Each one was engraved with a single word. Together, I had these made for us, Ethan explained, handing one to Margaret and the other to Isabel. It's a reminder that no matter where life takes us, we're in this together. Isabel clasped the pendant in her hands, her throat tightening with emotion. Margaret immediately fastened hers around her neck, her smile radiant. This means so much, Margaret said, her voice thick with gratitude. Thank you, Ethan. Ethan nodded, his heart full. We've lost a lot of time, but we have a lifetime ahead of us to make up for it. As the day drew to a close, the 3 of them stood together on the hotel balcony, the city stretching out before them. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, a fitting backdrop for the new chapter they were about to embark on. Isabel turned to Margaret, her eyes filled with warmth. You've given me something I thought I'd never have again, a reason to hope. Margaret smiled, her voice steady. And you've given me something I've dreamed of my whole life, a family. Ethan placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his gaze steady as he looked out at the horizon. This is just the beginning, he said. We have a future to build, together, as the sun dipped below the skyline. The 3 of them stood united, ready to face whatever lay ahead with love, resilience, and the promise of a new beginning.